Good afternoon. I am Ashley Boggan Dreff at High Point University in North Carolina. As a historian, I am going to spend my 15 minutes of fame highlighting a small moment from our past. In my recently published book entitled Entangled: A History of American Methodism, Politics, and Sexuality, I spend a lot of time talking about Methodism and how it has debated aspects of human sexuality, including birth control, divorce, abortion, and LGBTQIA persons throughout the 20th century. Given that I cannot condense an entire book's argument and evidence to 15 minutes, today I'm going to focus on the 1960s, specifically on the Methodist Church's endorsement of the new morality, a situational ethic which omitted a rules-based approach to sexuality and other aspects of our lives, and promoted instead a Christian decision-making process which prioritized loving actions made by mature, whole persons. I'll focus on a Methodist sex ed curriculum to evidence how this ethic was promoted and how its use created division in the denomination. I'll conclude with a reevaluation of the new morality as an apt Wesleyan sexual ethic. So I first stumbled upon the new morality while listening to a 1965 episode of Night Call, a call-in radio show produced by the Television, Radio, and Film Commission of the Methodist Church. Historian's side note, all episodes of Night Call are available thanks to the lovely people at GCAH. The episode was called Playboyism, a New Religious Alternative. And its guest speaker was Dr. Alan Moore, professor of Church and Society at Claremont School of Theology. The host of the show, Russ Gibb, inquired as to whether or not the Playboy philosophy had replaced the church as the authority on sex. To respond, Dr. Moore introduces the new morality. He clarified that, quote, the new morality means many different things, end quote. For Hugh Hefner, the new morality was simply a, quote, greater sense of sexual freedom. For Methodist theologians using the new morality, however, it meant that the church needed to, quote, think through what is right today and certainly think through the things we've said have been wrong, end quote. In other words, the church needs to honestly look at how it had talked about sex, what was right, what was wrong, and how did these rights and wrongs work in the context of the 1960s. In fact, many Christian theologians of the 1960s endorsed the new morality as a responsible sexual ethic for it stressed, quote, the one absolute Christian value of love, while de-emphasizing the importance of absolute laws in discerning what a Christian ought to do, end quote. Instead of listing acts that were right and moral and other acts as wrong, immoral, perhaps even incompatible, the new morality prioritized loving acts, period. Perhaps the most overt way the Methodist Church adapted this love-based ethic was in the 1960s in a sex ed curriculum entitled Sex and the Whole Person, written by Frank E. Weir. The goal of Sex and the Whole Person was to teach adolescents to be more aware of the ubiquity of choice and how to make informed decisions that would ultimately, quote, contribute to love and trust between persons and bring and express unity within a person. This sex ed curriculum hoped to show 1960s teenagers that being sexual involved a lot more than the act of intercourse. We are sexual beings from birth, imbued with a God-given and good sexuality that is a vital part of our personality, one that should be expressed and should mature throughout our lifetimes. The goal for sexuality isn't the act of sex, but being able to love as a whole person. So what is a whole person? Weir used scripture to define a whole person as one that can decide, create, and communicate. Paraphrasing here, God didn't have to create community, God decided to. God didn't have to be involved in our lives, but God decided to communicate with us. When humanity makes decisions, creates relationships, and communicates with others, they are living into the image of God according to the new morality. But the goal was to be a mature whole person. Now, remember these 4 characteristics I'm about to say, for we'll revisit them at the end. A mature whole person is one who is caring, responsible, respectful, and knowledgeable. With this curriculum, Methodist adolescents weren't taught the logistics of sexual intercourse and left with a list of don'ts. Instead, Methodist adolescents were taught how to evaluate themselves and their place in the world. They were taught how to recognize others as whole persons through engaging in caring, responsible, respectful, and knowledgeable relationships. Understanding these values, they were taught to ask themselves 4 questions before engaging in any action. 1, is there real communication here? 2, am I acting as a child of God and from a good motive? 3, does the relationship support and protect the involved persons as children of God? And 4, does my behavior affirm the dignity and self-worth for which God created me? The new morality was also used by local churches and ordained clergy. I don't have time to go into too much detail, but ministers such as the Reverend John V. Moore used the new morality as the basis of a sermon series on the importance of sexuality in human relationships. Others, like Reverend Ted McIlvaina, used it to create the Council on Religion and the Homosexual, an organization which was endorsed by Methodist boards and agencies and replicated in cities across America. And in Kansas City, Reverend Paul Jones used it to argue for same-sex weddings as early as 1970. It was also used to support abortion rights in New York City by the Reverend Finley Schaeff, who created the Clergy Consultation Service on Abortion. I mention these here not only to tease you and hope that you'll immediately purchase a copy of Entangled, but also to confirm that the new morality was a widely used sexual ethic in the 1960s. However, the new morality was not popular with all Methodists. And this is where I argue it is foundational to the divisions that emerged in 1972. Reverend Charles Kaiser was the creator and editor of Good News magazine and of its subsequent Good News movement. At the 1970 convocation, which began the self-proclaimed evangelical movement, Kaiser spoke on the, quote, crisis in our church. Beginning with a perceived lack of real evangelism, Kaiser then spends a few minutes critiquing the United Methodist understanding of Christian love. Quote, is it Christian love when United Methodist curriculum editors force upon the church secular concepts so radical that many loyal Methodists feel obliged to leave the church rather than subject their children to the new morality, end quote. Here, Kaiser not only confirms the continued use and popularity of the new morality, but also prioritizes critique of its use as part of the evangelical agenda. Critiques of the new morality were found throughout Good News magazine in 1970 and 1971, only to be replaced with indictments of gay and lesbian persons after 1972. In the July to September 1970 issue, a United Methodist Bill of Rights takes up a 2-page spread. Pertaining to our discussion today, United Methodists should have the right to, quote, not have church youth training debased to mere life adjustment, situation ethics, sensitivity training, and the like, end quote. Here again, the new morality as a situational ethic is named as debasing youth. In another article entitled, The Crisis in Methodist Curriculum, Kaiser claimed that the United Methodist Young Adult Curriculum is, quote, filled with endorsements of the new morality, questions the authority of the Bible, emasculates Christ of his divine powers, questions civil obedience, and encourages the cause of atheistic communism, end quote. You gotta love Kaiser. While other groups, such as the Louisville Annual Conference, were critical of the new morality, it was Good News that helped organize this criticism into a movement to change the Methodist sexual ethic back into a rules-based ethic. And that is just what Good News did. Throughout the last 50 years, they have organized and had enough political clout to reintroduce rules, restrictions, and bans into the new morality. We can see this beginning at the 1972 General Conference. When the Social Principles Study Commission wrote the social principles for the newly formed denomination, it used the new morality as a foundational ethic. The original paragraph, entitled Human Sexuality, supports the new morality in its opening lines. Quote, we recognize that sexuality is a good gift of God, and we believe persons may be fully human only when that gift is acknowledged and affirmed by themselves, the church, and society. We call all persons to disciplines that lead to the fulfillment of themselves, others, and society in the stewardship of that gift, end quote. The emphasis on being fully human and seeking fulfillment of ourselves is synonymous with being whole persons. These opening lines recognize sexuality as a vital and good part of God's creation, and that persons can only be truly whole when they acknowledge and affirm their sexuality as part of their whole self. It calls on others, and especially on the church, to also recognize the fullness of everyone's humanity, including their sexuality. The new morality was found outside the social principles as well. In a section of the 1972 Book of Discipline entitled Our Theological Task, we find a call for, quote, profound and urgent moral decisions, end quote, within the ever-changing and complex social situation of the 1970s. The section continues, quote, we do not possess infallible rules to follow or reflex habits that suffice or precedents for simple imitation, end quote. Now remember, these documents are written between 1968 and 1972 and were meant as a reflection on the social revolutions of recent decades: civil rights, women's rights, gay rights, the Vietnam War, just to name a few. In this section, the denomination, or at least the General Conference, admitted that it didn't have rules or examples to follow for its current context. So they said, quote, whatever may be our differences of heritage or mindset, we are forced to re-examine our convictions and alter our attitudes towards our own future and the human future as well, end quote. In 1972, the New Morality's affirmation of the goodness of our God-given sexuality in all of its forms was rejected with the insertion of the incompatibility clause, which limited the ability for gay and lesbian persons to embrace their sexuality as part of what makes them a whole person. After 1972, the target of Good News magazine shifted away from an attack on the New Morality and towards limiting the rights of LGBTQIA persons in the denomination. By doing so, however, they still managed to undercut the New Morality as a Methodist sexual ethic. Through bans and chargeable offenses, the Good News movement and its allies have continuously inserted rules and prohibitions into an ethic which was never meant to have rules or prohibitions. However, if you look at some of the sex ed curriculum published by Abingdon Press today, you can still see that the New Morality is being taught to United Methodist teens. If we want to move forward as Methodists, united or not, we need to reevaluate our sexual ethic and give the New Morality another shot. When you take away the sexual component to the New Morality, it really comes down to informing people, having them think through a situation at hand, weighing possible outcomes, and choosing what is a loving, caring, responsible, and respectful thing to do. As such, the New Morality is actually quite an appropriate Wesleyan ethic. Remember, the basis of the New Morality is a prioritization of love. And for Wesley, it didn't matter if we thought alike. What mattered was that we love alike. The goal of the New Morality was to create a whole person, one who loved continuously. In Wesleyan terms, one who was seeking to achieve perfection in this life. To be perfect in love was to be a mature whole person, one who is caring, respectful, knowledgeable, and responsible. And I don't have time to get to the thought experiment that I wanted to leave you all with, so I'm just going to leave it to the room. I want you all to think through, what if we were to overlay these 4 qualities of being caring, respectful, knowledgeable, and responsible with Wesley's preferred methods of interpretation of scripture, tradition, reason, and experience? If we can be mature, whole Wesleyans who use scripture, tradition, reason, and experience to engage in caring, respectful, knowledgeable, and responsible relationships, then we can find a more inclusive and affirming way forward.